In the darkest corners of America's most fortified prisons, there exist men who are feared by even the worst among us. Men whose names send chills through cell blocks, whose crimes defy human comprehension, and whose very existence challenges what we believe about good and evil. These are not petty criminals. They are not just killers. They are predators, manipulators, masters of violence who thrive in the chaos most people fear. Some commanded death cults. Some hunted innocence for pleasure. Some turned prison walls into battlegrounds, stacking up victims even after they were locked away. Each one carries a legacy written in blood. Each one has left scars not just on their victims, but on the very institutions built to contain them. Inside the concrete and steel, where society has cast away its monsters, a chilling truth remains. Here, the strong prey on the weak. Here, evil is not defeated by captivity. It adapts, it festers, it grows. Tonight, we open the gates to this hidden world and face the deadliest men ever imprisoned in the United States. But be warned, some monsters don't vanish when the cell door slams shut. Some become even more dangerous. And once you look into their eyes, you may never forget what you see. Case 1, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. There are killers who hide their darkness behind masks of charm. And then there was Richard Ramirez, a man who wore evil on his skin like armor. Born in 1960, raised in the searing streets of El Paso, Texas, Ramirez's early life was steeped in horror. He was just a boy when he witnessed his cousin, a Vietnam veteran, casually murder his own wife in front of him. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, something inside him cracked open, and from that wound, something monstrous began to grow. By the time Ramirez drifted into Los Angeles in 1984, he was no longer just a troubled youth. He had become something else entirely, a predator without pity, without remorse. They called him the Night Stalker, a name whispered across California with terror as bodies began to fall under covered darkness. No one was safe, young, old, rich, poor, it didn't matter. He would slip through windows like a phantom, armed with guns, knives, or whatever he'd find. He delighted in chaos. He reveled in pain. Often, he would leave behind strange symbols, pentagrams scrawled on walls, or even carved into the flesh of his victims. He claimed allegiance to Satan himself. And when dragged into court, Ramirez grinned with blackened teeth and raised his hand to reveal a pentagram drawn in his palm. "Hail Satan," he hissed as the cameras rolled. It wasn't just murder. It was terror made flesh. And behind bars, it didn't stop. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death in 1989, convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. But his true number of victims may forever remain unknown. Inside San Quentin's death row, he became a symbol of pure, undiluted evil. He spent his days surrounded by some of the most dangerous men in America, yet it was Ramirez who many feared the most. Inmates spoke in hushed tones about the black cloud that seemed to hang over his cell. Guards reported feeling chilled by his presence, as if he brought something else inside the prison walls. Something colder, darker than just crime. And yet, horrifyingly, Ramirez became something of a dark celebrity. He received love letters by the hundreds, women desperate to claim a piece of his infamy. One woman, Doreen Leoe, a magazine editor, even married him in 1996, calling him kind, funny, and misunderstood. But the truth of Richard Ramirez was something far more malevolent. His cold, reptilian stare betrayed a mind that fed on pain. His words, few as they were, revealed a man who saw life and death as mere toys for his amusement. And he was patient. Death row stretches on for years in California. But Ramirez didn't rage against the weight. He smiled. He waited, like a spider, content in the center of a widening web. Ultimately, it was not the gas chamber that claimed Richard Ramirez. In 2013, after 23 years on death row, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma. There was no final confession, no apologies, no regrets, only a cold, empty departure, a monster slipping into the darkness he had always served. Some say Ramirez's death was the closing of a terrifying chapter in American crime history. Others believe that men like him don't really die. Their legacy lingers. in the fears that creep up when the sun sets, in the nightmares that whisper that true evil walks the earth, smiling in the dark. Richard Ramirez didn't just kill people. He killed the illusion that there are safe places, and in doing so, he earned his place among the deadliest men ever to walk behind prison walls. Case 2. Thomas Silverstein, the most dangerous prisoner in America. Most killers are caged after a lifetime of terror. Thomas Silverstein built his reign of terror from within the cage itself. Born in 1952, Silverstein's early life was a blueprint for violence, a childhood marked by poverty, anger, and an obsession with dominance. By 1977, he found himself in prison for armed robbery. But Silverstein wasn't content with simply serving time. He would soon become something the American prison system had never truly seen before. A man so violent, so utterly uncontrollable, that officials were forced to erase him from society without ever setting him free. Inside prison, Silverstein joined the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist gang that ruled cell blocks through blood and fear. His reputation grew with every brutal assault, but it was in 1980 that he crossed a line that would define him forever. He stabbed fellow inmate Danny Atwell to death, claiming Atwell had been a rat. Convicted of murder, Silverstein was transferred to a maximum security unit at Marion Federal Penitentiary, at the time, one of the harshest prisons in the country. But even here, the walls were not strong enough to contain him. In 1981, he murdered again, this time another inmate named Robert Chappelle. Then, just months later, Silverstein and his close ally, Clayton Fountain, orchestrated one of the most infamous acts of prison violence in U.S. history. On October 22, 1983, armed with homemade shanks, Silverstein attacked and murdered Correctional Officer Merle Klutz in cold blood, stabbing him over 40 times in a savage ambush. He later claimed Klutz had been harassing him, moving him constantly and messing with his mind. But whatever the justification, the result was the same: a blood-soaked hallway, a prison plunged into chaos, a system left reeling. No inmate had ever managed to kill a federal corrections officer inside one of America's most secure prisons, until Thomas Silverstein. The federal government responded with brutal swiftness. Silverstein was immediately placed under what came to be called no human contact status, an unofficial sentence of permanent solitary confinement, a windowless, soundproof cell, no physical interaction with other people, no conversation, no sunlight, no touch. Guards rolled his meals under the door. His hands were shackled even to walk a few feet for showers. Cameras watched him at all times. They built a tomb for a living man, because there was no other way to contain the beast inside. And yet, astonishingly, Silverstein adapted. He spent decades in that tiny box, drawing, writing, and maintaining an icy discipline. In his writings, Silverstein portrayed himself as a man created by the system, a victim of brutality forced to become a monster just to survive. But few were willing to see him as anything other than what he had become, a man who turned a prison sentence into a death sentence for others. Over the years, Silverstein's name became legend inside America's prison system. Inmate folklore spoke of him in the same breath as serial killers, a cautionary tale of what happens when violence and isolation feed endlessly on one another. In 2019, after spending more than 36 years in solitary confinement, the longest stretch in U.S. prison history, Thomas Silverstein died of complications from heart surgery at the age of 67. He never again walked among free men. He never again touched the open air. In death, he left behind a legacy that haunts prison corridors to this day. The understanding that sometimes true evil doesn't just explode outward, it simmers quietly, locked away, forever watching, forever waiting. Thomas Silverstein didn't escape his cell. He became the darkness within it. Case 3. Charles Manson, the master of manipulation. Some killers use their hands. Others use their minds. Charles Manson was a man who didn't need to hold a knife to be soaked in blood. Born in 1934 to a troubled young mother, Manson's life spiraled into crime almost from the moment he could walk. Petty theft, armed robbery, car theft. Prison became his home long before the world knew his name. But it wasn't violence that made Manson dangerous. It was something far worse. Charles Manson knew how to find the cracks inside people's souls and break them wide open. In the late 1960s, drifting into the heart of California's counterculture, Manson gathered around him a group of lost young people, outcasts, runaways, idealists. He called them his family. Under Manson's control, they abandoned their old lives and surrendered completely, mind, body, and spirit. With a toxic cocktail of drugs, isolation, fear, and charisma, Manson transformed them into weapons. His warped prophecy, a coming race war he dubbed Helter Skelter, drove his commands. And in August 1969, his vision erupted into bloodshed. The Manson family carried out a series of gruesome murders across Los Angeles at Manson's bidding. Actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was stabbed 16 times. Friends staying with her were butchered alongside her. The next night, 2 more victims, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, were found slain, their home defaced with blood-scrawled messages. And all the while, Charles Manson stayed behind the scenes, orchestrating death like a conductor leading an orchestra of madness. When authorities finally closed in, they weren't just capturing a murderer. They were facing a man who had turned others into murderers, with nothing but his voice and his will. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, even though he never physically killed any of the victims himself. He was sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty. But prison walls were no match for Manson's dark charisma. From inside California's toughest prisons, including San Quentin and Corcoran State Prison, Manson continued to captivate the world. Tattoos carved into his skin, his wild, piercing eyes, his cryptic rants in televised interviews. He became a living myth, a symbol of corrupted innocence, a warning that evil doesn't always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it preaches love, even as it breeds death. Fellow inmates avoided him. Guards treated him with wary distrust. He was attacked multiple times behind bars, nearly killed in 1984 when an inmate set him on fire, burning over 20% of his body. Yet somehow, Manson endured, grinning, speaking in riddles, spinning webs of insanity around him until his dying breath. On November 19, 2017, after nearly 5 decades locked away, Charles Manson died of natural causes at the age of 83. There was no grand final confession, no redemption arc, just silence, and the chilling realization that his influence still lingered. Even after death, his followers, his crimes, and his philosophies remained carved into the American psyche. Charles Manson showed the world that true evil doesn't always come with a knife or a gun. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, a song, a twisted promise of belonging. Case 4, Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Most killers hide in the shadows. Rodney Alcala stepped into the spotlight and smiled. Born in 1943, Alcala seemed on the surface to have every advantage: intelligence, charm, even a promising career in photography. But beneath that polished exterior lurked a predator unlike any the world had seen. In 1978, the nation watched as Rodney Alcala appeared on the popular TV show The Dating Game, a slick, handsome bachelor charming the audience and the contestant alike. No one in that studio knew that the man grinning under the bright lights was already a monster. By the time Alcala smiled for those cameras, he had already committed unspeakable acts. He lured young women and children into his grasp with the promise of modeling opportunities, or simply by flashing a smile that disarmed every warning instinct. And once he had them, the true horror began. Alcala was a sadist, a man who derived pleasure not just from killing, but from stretching the moment of death as long as possible. He would strangle his victims until they lost consciousness, then wait, let them revive, and do it again. A sick game of control, pain, and terror. His victims, often young girls and women, endured unspeakable cruelty before the end mercifully came. Arrested multiple times in the early 1970s, Alcala somehow kept slipping through the cracks of the justice system. Released early, charges dropped, light sentences handed down. It wasn't until 1979, when 12-year-old Robin Samso vanished on her way to a ballet lesson, that Alcala's reign of terror truly began to unravel. When investigators searched his storage unit, they uncovered a horror gallery, hundreds of photographs of women, girls, and even young boys, many never identified to this day. Smiling faces, carefree poses, frozen moments taken seconds before their fates were sealed. Alcala was eventually convicted of multiple murders, but authorities believe his true number of victims could be in the dozens, possibly even over 100. Every new investigation into cold cases brought more chilling connections to the man who had once flirted and laughed on national television. In prison, Rodney Alcala was no less a manipulator. Representing himself at trial, he turned his court appearances into a twisted theater, speaking in bizarre third-person monologues, cross-examining witnesses, and playing mind games with the jury. Sentenced to death in 2010, Alcala's crimes continue to unravel even from behind bars, as investigators link him to more unsolved murders across the country. His legacy wasn't just body counts. It was a lingering sense of horror that someone so monstrous could blend so easily into the everyday world. A co-worker, a neighbor, a man smiling on your television screen. Rodney Alcala spent his final years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, a forgotten relic of evil among other predators and killers. In July 2021, Alcala died of natural causes at the age of 77. There were no final words of remorse, no apologies to the families he destroyed, only silence, as the light of one of the most cunning serial killers in American history finally flickered out. Rodney Alcala didn't just kill his victims. He stole their stories, their futures, their very identities. And even now, decades later, investigators still comb the photographs he left behind. Faces frozen in time, searching for names, searching for justice. Because true evil doesn't always come in the form of a monster lurking in the dark. Sometimes it walks right into the spotlight and smiles. Case 5. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. In the annals of American crime, few names carry the cold, clinical horror of Gary Ridgway. The man who became known as the Green River Killer didn't hunt in darkness or madness. He hunted in plain sight, methodically, remorselessly, almost mechanically. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Ridgway appeared unremarkable, a soft-spoken truck painter with a quiet demeanor. He blended into a suburban life so perfectly that even as the bodies piled up, no one suspected the monster living among them. But beneath that ordinary mask was a predator of historic proportions. In the early 1980s, the nightmare began. Women, many of them runaways, sex workers, vulnerable and forgotten, started vanishing near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. Some were last seen getting into a dark pickup truck. Days or weeks later, their bodies would turn up, dumped near the banks of Green River, strangled, discarded like garbage. The killings became so numerous, so relentless, that investigators soon realized they weren't facing a normal criminal. They were facing a ghost. Ridgway chose his victims carefully, those least likely to be immediately missed, those society too often failed to protect. He would offer them a ride, gain their trust, just long enough to get them alone. Then, with chilling calmness, he would attack, strangling them with his bare hands or with ligatures he prepared in advance. And even after death, Ridgway's cruelty continued. He often returned to the bodies, sometimes days later, to commit acts so depraved they remain difficult to even describe. In his own words, he admitted to viewing the corpses as possessions, objects he could revisit whenever he wished. For years, the Green River Task Force hunted the Phantom Killer. They interviewed Ridgway multiple times. He even passed a polygraph test. A quiet, chilling reminder that monsters don't always tremble under scrutiny. The breakthrough wouldn't come until decades later, with the advent of DNA technology. In 2001, Ridgway was finally arrested after new forensic testing linked him to several of the murders. And once in custody, the full scale of his evil came crashing down. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing at least 71 women, though he later hinted the true number could be much higher. In interviews, he spoke with detached calm, describing his murders as if recounting a routine chore. No emotion, no regret, Just the cold, efficient words of a man who had killed more human beings than almost any other in U.S. history. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for his full cooperation, he was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each known victim at the time. Today, he lives out his existence in Washington State Penitentiary, a forgotten old man inside a concrete box. No spotlight, no audience, only endless days and endless nights to face the monstrous memories of what he has done. Gary Ridgway didn't kill in a frenzy. He didn't kill for fame or for twisted love. He killed because it was easy, because it fed something cold and hollow inside him. His story serves as a chilling reminder. Evil doesn't always come dressed in black or bearing knives. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it smiles from across the street. Sometimes it sits quietly in traffic, planning its next move. Gary Ridgway was not the monster under the bed. He was the monster standing quietly beside you, invisible, patient, deadly. Case 6, Robert Berdella, the Kansas City butcher. Some killers crave the act of killing. Others crave total domination. Robert Berdella was the kind of monster nightmares warn us about, but few could ever imagine the full depth of his depravity. Born in 1949 in Ohio, Berdella's early life gave little hint of the horror to come. By the 1970s, he had moved to Kansas City, Missouri, where he ran a small curiosity shop called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, selling oddities, antiques, and strange relics. But behind the walls of his ordinary-looking house at 4315 Charlotte Street, Berdella was assembling his real collection. Between 1984 and 1987, young men, drifters, hustlers, vulnerable souls, began vanishing from the streets of Kansas City. Some were last seen alive entering Berdella's home. None ever came out. Berdella's method was uniquely horrifying. He didn't simply kill. He abducted. He restrained. He tortured. For days, sometimes weeks, meticulously documenting his atrocities with photographs and detailed journals. His victims were subjected to unimaginable suffering, electric shocks, chemical burns, brutal physical assaults. Berdella sought to erase their identities, to reduce human beings to something less, something he could command, punish, and ultimately destroy at will. He disposed of their remains like trash, often putting body parts out with the neighborhood's ordinary garbage collection. To the outside world, he remained a soft-spoken man, respected by local businesses. No one knew the house on Charlotte Street was a slaughterhouse built on cruelty and domination. The nightmare only ended by accident. In 1988, a young man named Christopher Bryson managed to escape, naked, battered, and bleeding, by jumping from a second-story window while Berdella was momentarily distracted. Bryson's testimony cracked the facade wide open. Police stormed Berdella's home and found a scene straight out of hell: torture equipment, hundreds of photographs documenting the degradation of his victims, personal belongings of the missing. In total, Berdella was charged with the murders of 6 young men, though the true number could be higher. At trial, Berdella showed almost no emotion. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, receiving multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, in prison. Berdella remained largely isolated, a pariah even among the worst of society. His notoriety and the grotesque nature of his crimes made him a marked man inside those walls. Fellow inmates despised him. Guards watched him with a mix of revulsion and caution. Berdella never found peace, not in his cell, not in his mind. On October 8, 1992, Robert Berdella died a heart attack at the age of 43, ending one of the most twisted lives America has ever known. No one mourned him. No vigils were held. No tears were shed. His house was razed to the ground, as if the earth itself sought to erase the stain he left behind. Robert Berdella was not a killer of passion or desperation. He was a cold technician of terror, a man who systematically dismantled the lives of those he deemed weak enough to capture. His legacy is not just one of death. It is one of unimaginable suffering, cruelty, and a chilling reminder that true evil sometimes wears the blandest face of all. These men, these monsters, remind us of truth we often try to forget. Evil is not confined to nightmares. It walks among us. It smiles. It waits, and sometimes it leaves behind scars so deep the world never fully heals. In the darkest corners of our prisons, these killers now sit, stripped of power, forgotten by time. But their stories, their horrors, still echo through the walls they cannot escape. Evil may be locked away, but it is never truly gone. If you found this glimpse into the minds of the deadliest men in U.S. prisons haunting, make sure to like this video to help it reach others who need to see just how far humanity can fall. Subscribe to our channel for more journeys into the darkest true crime stories, the ones history dares not forget. And turn on notifications, because next time we'll go even deeper into the shadows. Until then, stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, monsters are real. They're just better at hiding.